In the late 12th century, England was living through a moment of uncertainty. In 1184, a fire had devastated Glastonbury Abbey, one of the most important monasteries in the country. Its buildings were in ruins, and donations had drastically decreased. In the middle of that crisis, in 1191, the monks announced something that seemed like a miracle. They had found the tomb of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. The monks claimed to have discovered a large stone slab, and beneath it, an oak coffin with a lead cross. On it could be read an inscription in Latin that said, "Here lies buried the illustrious King Arthur on the Isle of Avalon." Inside, they claimed to have found the bones of a man of great stature and the remains of a woman with fair hair. The news spread rapidly throughout all of England. Pilgrims came from everywhere. Nobles sent donations, and Glastonbury recovered part of its former splendor. The monastery was reviving, and with it, the legend. Still, something didn't quite add up. No earlier source mentioned an Arthur tomb in that place. The discovery had conveniently arrived just when the abbey most needed to shine again. Over the centuries, historical and archaeological investigation reviewed that episode with scrutiny. No evidence exists linking those remains to any real person named Arthur. Today, in fact, most specialists believe the supposed discovery was a deliberate fabrication designed to bring pilgrims and donations after the fire. Even so, the maneuver was a success. That empty tomb brought back to life a king who probably never existed. Or maybe he did, but we'll see that later. And from a fictitious coffin was born one of Europe's most powerful legends. If his tomb was a forgery, did King Arthur ever exist? And what if England's greatest hero was actually born from a lie? To search for the answer, we have to travel centuries back to a time when the British Isle was torn between ruin and hope, an era when history and myth still walked hand in hand. When Rome's power crumbled in Britannia at the beginning of the 5th century, it didn't just leave ruins and roads covered with weeds. It also left an enormous void and a country without direction. For almost 4 centuries, the empire had governed the island with its administration, its army, and its laws. But in the year 411, Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the British cities saying they should defend themselves. The legions were called back to Italy to protect Rome from Germanic invasions, and with them disappeared all central authority. From that moment on, historical sources become quite obscure. No contemporary chronicles exist, only texts written decades later when the collapse was already part of memory. One of the few authors who spoke of it was Gildas, a 6th century monk who wrote De Excidio Britanniae about the ruin of Britain, a work that offered no precise dates or names, but described a divided country, governed by small local tyrants and besieged by Germanic peoples, by Saxons, Angles, and Jutes arrived from northern Germany and Denmark, who were first hired as mercenaries and then stayed as invaders. Archaeology supports much of this image. After the Roman withdrawal, many cities drastically shrank and lost their administrative role. Londinium, modern-day London, was almost abandoned. Large rural villas like Chedworth or Fishburn became agricultural villages, or were also abandoned. Still, for a time, people continued clinging to Roman customs. They spoke Latin, used mosaics, and maintained some public baths. But little by little, all that disappeared. The use of currency fell into disuse. Trade with the continent collapsed. The territory gradually fragmented into small, local domains. Britannia had transformed into an unstable mosaic where violence was common, and the border between history and myth began to blur. Among that chaos arose stories about leaders who tried to resist. Gildas mentions a victory of the Britons against the Saxons, led by a certain Ambrosius Aurelianus, whom he describes as a moderate and brave man whose parents had died during the wars. He provides no more details, but his name reappears in later traditions. Some historians believe Ambrosius was a real chief from the mid-5th century, and that over time, his figure could have merged with what would later be King Arthur's. The only certain thing is that an organized resistance existed, though brief, before the Saxon waves definitely imposed themselves. A series of 12 battles, fought by the Britons, is also mentioned, though no one knows for certain where or when they occurred, and they don't even know if they really existed. But meanwhile, the remains of the past kept speaking. In Tintagel, a fortress built on the cliffs of Cornwall, archaeologists have found fragments of pottery and amphorae from the Mediterranean and North Africa, along with remains of luxury glass. These findings, dated between the 5th and 6th centuries, show that some British enclaves maintained contact with foreign trade even after the Roman collapse. The site appears to have been used by a local elite that had resources and connections, and was powerful and cultured enough to inspire future legends. There's no trace of any historical Arthur in that place, but there is proof that leaders existed with enough influence to feed collective memory. War, misery, and political fragmentation created something more than ruins. They left a symbolic void. And in the midst of chaos, people needed to believe in someone who would protect them, in a just chief who embodied the lost values of the old Roman order against the Saxon advance. In that silence, without concrete names, the idea began to form of a warlord who would lead the last resistance of the Britons. For centuries, Arthur's name doesn't appear in any contemporary source, or in the centuries immediately following his supposed era. No Roman chronicler mentions him, and not even Gildas said a single word about him. Gildas does mention the Battle of Badon, a great victory of the Britons against invaders, as I've already told you, but he gives no names of any leader or hero. That silence is so profound that many historians say the first Arthur wasn't born from history, but from memory, and that memory took almost 4 centuries to take shape. The first time the name appears is in the Historia Brittonum, written around the year 830 and traditionally attributed to a Welsh monk named Nennius. The text is a mix of chronicle, genealogies, myths, and local legends. In one of its passages, it mentions a warrior named Arturus, presented not as a king, but as Dux Bellorum, that is, as chief of battles. According to the account, this leader would have achieved 12 victories against the enemies of the Britons, the last being at Mount Badon. That brief fragment changed history, because for the first time, someone called a hero from the past Arthur. What's interesting is that in that text, there's no throne, no Camelot, no Excalibur. Arthur appears as a military commander and not as a monarch. In the list of British kings that accompanies the work, his name doesn't even appear. Some historians suggest Arthur could have been more a symbol, a figure representing the chiefs who resisted. But the fact is that, a century later, his name reappears in the Annales Cambria, which was a compilation of brief historical notes written in the mid-10th century, though based on earlier sources. There, 2 episodes are mentioned. One, that in the year 516, the Battle of Badon took place, in which Arthur, it says, carried the cross of Christ on his shoulders and was victorious. And another, that in the year 537, the Battle of Camelot was fought, in which Arthur and Mordred fell. These dates should be taken with caution. The annals don't follow a reliable chronology, but still, the text is important because it introduces 2 key ideas that would survive in all later tradition: Arthur's final victory and his heroic death. There's still no trace of magic, legendary swords, or Knights of the Round Table, but the myth already had its seed. These 2 mentions are the only direct references to Arthur in Latin texts prior to the 10th century. Everything else we know about that first Arthur comes from folklore and Welsh poetry. In the oldest preserved poems, dated between the 9th and 10th centuries, Arthur isn't a king. He's a hero of the Celtic world, In those texts, he faces giants, monsters, and creatures from the other world. In some stories, he even descends to Onwin, the underworld of Welsh mythology. There are no thrones or castles there, but magic, impossible battles, and supernatural companions. Christianity barely appears, because gods, beasts, and portals to the beyond still dominated the tale. In several poems, Arthur appears alongside mythical figures like the hunting dogs of the otherworld, or helping the hero Colwich in his quest for Olwen in one of the oldest tales of Welsh literature. In these versions, Arthur doesn't govern an idealized kingdom, but leads a band of almost supernatural warriors, an echo of the tribal heroes of Celtic folklore. All this shows something essential. Long before becoming a Christian king, Arthur was a pagan hero. He belonged to the Celtic imagination, to a universe populated by magic, sacred animals, and journeys to the other world. Over the centuries, when Christianity consolidated in Wales and old traditions began to transform, poets adapted that story to new values. Between the 10th and 11th centuries, Arthur began to be represented as a defender of the faith and as a symbol of the resistance against evil. The monsters became barbarians, and mythological feats were reinterpreted as Christian deeds. I'll take this opportunity to ask you to like the video and send it to whoever you think might enjoy it. And subscribe if you're not subscribed, because it's super important for the channel to keep growing. The thing is that this fusion between the pagan and Christian was what allowed the myth to survive. In a world where the Britons had lost their power to the Saxons, Arthur no longer offered just adventures, but an identity. He represented a heroic past that reminded people who they had been. So it began as a note in a Latin chronicle, transformed over time into the heart of an entire mythology. The Arthur myth began to expand like mist over Avalon, slow but unstoppable. When we think of this character, we all have the same image in mind. The sword in the stone, the round table, the wizard Merlin, and a castle called Camelot. But you've already seen that none of that existed in the ancient sources. Everything appeared suddenly in the 12th century in a book written by a cleric trained in Wales who was probably of Welsh Norman origin named Geoffrey of Monmouth. With a single work, Geoffrey not only changed the history of British literature, but gave definitive form to King Arthur as we know him today. His book, Historia Regum Britannia, History of the Kings of Britain, was presented as a chronicle of the country's past from the myths of Brutus's descendants from Troy to the 7th century. In practice, it was a mixture of genealogies, Celtic legends, political ambitions, and much imagination. But at that time, no one spoke of critical history, and the public took it as completely real. Geoffrey claimed his work was the translation of a mysterious ancient book in the British language that, of course, no one ever saw. This was a common resource in the Middle Ages, invoking a lost source to give authority to what was narrated. Most likely, Geoffrey combined Old Welsh traditions, Latin texts, and oral accounts, and united them in a great epic that filled the gaps in the British past with heroes, battles, and wonders. And he did it with so much talent that for centuries, almost no one dared doubt him. In his version, Arthur is no longer a local warlord fighting the Saxons, but a monarch with throne, court, and a vast empire. He conquers Scotland, Ireland, and part of Gaul. Geoffrey presents him as a new Alexander the Great, as the model of the perfect king, brave, wise, and glorious. His Arthur doesn't just defend his land, but creates an empire. That's where the political background behind the myth appears. When Geoffrey wrote his book around 1136, England had been under Norman rule for 70 years. Those descendants of Vikings had become the country's new aristocracy, but they still sought a history that would justify their power. Geoffrey's work fit them like a glove. It presented the ancient British kings, including Arthur, as heirs to a glorious lineage, giving the island a common past that united conquerors and conquered under the same identity. Without mentioning them directly, It offered the Normans a place within Britannia's mythical history. The effect was immediate, because Historia Regum Britannia became a continental success. It was copied, translated, and read as if it were a real historical account. For more than 2 centuries, it was one of the most influential sources in Europe. Even the most critical chroniclers, like William of Newburgh, accused him of blatantly lying, but admitted it was impossible to compete with his popularity. Geoffrey had done what every narrator dreams of: tell a story so convincing that no one wanted to stop believing it. Moreover, he introduced characters and elements that would define the Arthurian universe forever. One of them was Merlin, the king's magical advisor. Geoffrey was inspired by a legendary figure known as Myrddin Wilt, a wild prophet from northern Britannia, and adapted his name to Merlinus to avoid its resemblance to an offensive word in French. He had already presented him before in his text, The Prophecies of Merlin. But in the history of the kings of Britain, he united him for the first time with Arthur, thus creating one of the most famous pairs in medieval literature. The sword Caliburnus also appears, which would later be known as Excalibur, symbol of divine power and the monarch's authority. Geoffrey narrates for the first time Arthur's birth, son of Uther Pendragon and Igerna, conceived thanks to Merlin's magical arts. All that gave the story a narrative coherence that made it seem almost like a biography rather than a legend. That said, Geoffrey had no qualms about exaggerating. In his account, Arthur defeats the Roman Empire, represented by the legate Lucius Tiberius, conquers much of Europe, and prepares to invade Rome until his nephew, Mordred, betrays him. With that plot, he transforms a possible local 6th century chief into an 11th century universal emperor. It was an epic fantasy, almost a literary revenge. The old British people humiliating Rome, their former oppressor. As exaggerated as it seems today, the account, as I say, had enormous power. It offered national pride in an age without heroes. It turned ruin into glory and gave England a past as great as Rome's or France's. The book spread at just the right moment. When courtly culture flourished in France and Normandy, European courts were fascinated by the ideals of chivalry, honor, and refined love. Poets and writers in French began adapting the story to their own style, filling it with impossible loves, valiant knights, and heroic deeds. Thus was born the romantic tone we associate with Camelot today. Though that literary turn would come a few decades later, even before Geoffrey, the monk William of Malmesbury, one of the most careful chroniclers of his time, had acknowledged he couldn't confirm Arthur's existence. But the public accepted Geoffrey's version as almost official truth. Geoffrey died around 1155, or shortly after, and surely never imagined his account would survive almost 1,000 years. The great irony is that by defining King Arthur as we know him, Geoffrey also erased the possible historical Arthur, if he ever existed. He covered him with a mountain of magic, impossible battles, and medieval fantasies. In the 12th century, the legend of King Arthur had already spread throughout Europe, but something was missing: physical proof. Something that would demonstrate it wasn't just a story. And that proof appeared just when it was most needed, or perhaps when it was most convenient. Around the year 1191, at the Benedictine Abbey of Glastonbury in southwest England, a group of monks announced a surprising find. They said they had discovered King Arthur's tomb. The writer Giraldus Cambrensis, or Gerald of Wales, who claimed to have been in Glastonbury shortly after, described the find as the monks told it to him. According to his account, beneath the slab were 2 oak coffins, one with the bones of a tall man, identified as Arthur, and another with those of a woman, supposedly Guinevere. He even narrated that upon opening her casket, locks of golden hair appeared that crumbled when touched. It was such a vivid description that many believed it word for word. The context, however, raised suspicions. A few years earlier, in 1184, A fire had devastated much of the abbey. Glastonbury, one of England's richest and most influential monasteries, had been left in ruins. Donations had decreased, and the monks needed funds to rebuild the place. Suddenly, the discovery attracted crowds of pilgrims with offerings and nobles willing to donate money. Thus, the abbey revived in very little time. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't rare. Monasteries competed to have the most venerated relics, bones of saints, fragments of the cross, or miraculous stories. Each abbey needed to bring pilgrims because pilgrims brought wealth. Glastonbury, which would later also be associated with Joseph of Arimathea and the legend of the Holy Grail, knew how to exploit the myth. Adding King Arthur's tomb to its repertoire was a masterstroke. For the next 2 centuries, the supposed tomb was a highlight of pilgrimage. In 1278, the monks moved the remains to a more visible place within the monastery, in a ceremony presided over by King Edward I and Queen Eleanor. The bones were deposited under a dark stone monument in the church choir, and the monarch's presence gave the entire act an air of legitimacy. That scene officially converted myth into history. But when modern archaeology arrived, the House of Cards collapsed. 20th century excavations demonstrated that the soil layers where the tomb was supposedly found belonged to the 11th century or later. That is, far from the era when, according to legends, Arthur would have lived. The famous lead cross disappeared centuries ago, and only transcriptions of its inscription are preserved, with Latin errors, by the way, that were improper for antiquity. And everything points to it being more of a medieval forgery, probably made by the monks themselves or someone in their circle. Still, the deception was ingenious. The inscription used the word Avalonia, directly connecting Glastonbury with Avalon, the mythical place where, according to Geoffrey, Arthur had been taken after being wounded. With that simple word, literary fiction joined religious devotion. It was a perfect play, linking England's most beloved myth with a place where the church needed to bring pilgrims. Moreover, the supposed find served to solve a political problem. At that time, a very popular prophecy circulated, that of the sleeping king. According to it, Arthur hadn't died, but rested somewhere hidden, waiting for the moment to return to save England from its enemies. For the Welsh, that idea was a symbol of hope and resistance against Norman rule. But if the monks proved Arthur was really dead and buried, that hope disappeared. In other words, the discovery also served the Norman crown, which wanted to end the myth of the return. During the dissolution of the monasteries ordered by Henry VIII in the 16th century, the abbey was plundered and Arthur's supposed remains disappeared at some point, probably during that process. But it no longer mattered, because the story had fulfilled its purpose. In subsequent centuries, Glastonbury remained surrounded by new legends, visions, dubious relics, and later, rumors linking it, as I've already said, with the Holy Grail. Today, most historians consider that discovery a forgery, but also a brilliant example of how the medieval church knew how to use myth as a tool of power. At that time, Arthur stopped being a warrior of legend to become something different, a lay saint, a national symbol, and a very profitable miracle. In the 20th century, archaeologists decided to ask themselves a question. What if behind all this legend, there was something real? They weren't looking for wizards, of course, or magical swords, but traces of a leader who, in post-Roman Empire Britannia, could have inspired the story. One of the first places to awaken true archaeological interest was Cadbury Hill in Somerset. For generations, local people called it Camelot, not because evidence existed, but because the hill, with its size and its walls, fit the image everyone had of King Arthur's castle. Between 1966 and 1970, Scottish archaeologist Leslie Alcock directed excavations there with BBC support, and what he found was more revealing than expected. Under the medieval layers appeared an earth-fortified enclosure with walls reinforced with stone and wood dating from the 5th or 6th century, just in the period when, according to the oldest sources, there could have been a British leader of resistance. The walls had been restored, and inside were found remains of banquets and objects imported from the Mediterranean, like pottery, wine, and oil, indicating a level of wealth that was uncommon in Britannia of that era. Alcock never said he found Camelot, and avoided using that word in his reports. But his excavations demonstrated that in southwest England, there existed very well-organized centers of power. They were British lordships with resources, culture, and contacts perfectly compatible with the idea of a powerful Celtic warlord like Ambrosius Aurelianus, or for many, Arthur himself. The press, however, didn't have the same caution, because the headlines of the 1960s spoke of Camelot's discovery, even though Alcock himself denied it. Another key point in this search was Tintagel on the coast of Cornwall. Geoffrey of Monmouth had placed Arthur's birth there in that site, and since then, the place became a magnet for researchers and dreamers. In 1998, a slate slab was discovered with an inscription in Latin mentioning a certain Artognu, a name some related to Old Welsh lineages. The media immediately rebaptized it as Arthur's Stone, though experts clarified it had no connection to the legendary king. Still, it showed that in the 6th century, there was literacy and culture continuity in Britannia. Far from being a barbarous land, it was a more complex society than believed, which is already quite revealing and was already a quite important discovery. Meanwhile, Glastonbury, the supposed site of Arthur's tomb, was also reviewed by modern archaeology. Excavations confirmed the monastery had ancient origins, and the area was inhabited since Roman times. But no trace appeared of a tomb related to Arthur or any character from his time. In fact, as I've already said, the soil layers of the supposed medieval discovery were quite more recent. Over the decades, findings in all these places composed a quite coherent panorama. After the Roman withdrawal, Britannia didn't completely sink as believed, but reorganized into small kingdoms that had local leaders and maintained certain structure, certain wealth, and commercial contacts with the Mediterranean and Gaul. But none of those chiefs can be safely identified as Arthur. If a real person existed behind the myth, he must have been one of those British warlords of the 5th or 6th century who fought against Saxon expansion. Some even point to Riothamus, a British leader mentioned by some Gallo-Roman chroniclers who fought in Gaul. But in all cases, the connection with the legendary Arthur remains a hypothesis and not proof. Still, what's interesting is that excavations confirm the context in which this myth could have been born. There were wars, alliances, fortresses, and leaders who had real power. It's possible that the story Geoffrey of Monmouth transformed into epic was originally a mixture of memories, fragmented facts, and local legends. There's no trace of Camelot, but many places that, for a time, could have resembled it. Today, no archaeologist claims to have found direct proof of King Arthur, but almost all agree his myth reflects a deeper truth, that of a culture that, in the face of collapse, turned its memory into legend. As Leslie Alcock himself said years after excavating at Cadbury Hill, "We didn't find Arthur, but we did find the kind of world in which Arthur would have made sense." Perhaps that's ultimately the only real clue the myth leaves. That's been everything for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and that you'll leave me in the comments what you knew about this story and whether you thought it was real or knew clearly it was just a myth. Thank you for watching this video. If you don't know what to comment, leave me this emoji and I'll give you a like as soon as I can. And now, yes, with nothing more to say, see you in the next one. Bye!